Hello. Thank you for joining us to learn about the work that's been done and the possibilities for the future of the facilities in the Bethel Park School District. I'm James Walsh, the superintendent. With me tonight.
Good evening, everybody. It's Zeb Jansani, assistant superintendent.
So it's our intention that by the end of the presentation, you'll be able to understand the facilities study that was conducted on behalf of the school district and understand the options that the board has to address the issues that were identified in the feasibility study. We're going to switch the camera over now so you can see the presentation. And
It's on.
there we go. Now you're getting to see it. Okay. So back in November of 2020, the Board of School Directors contracted with the Hayes Design Group to conduct a feasibility study of our facilities, infrastructure, and campuses. They had 5 general concerns in mind when they brought Hayes on to conduct the study. The first concern was the fact that most of the buildings on our campuses are aging. 5 elementaries and 2 middle schools, each with quite a bit of years between the last major renovation work and the current times. And the question they wanted to know from the feasibility study is, what should the district expect to do to maintain these buildings for the long term? The second question that they gave to the study team from Hayes was to discuss and analyze the enrollment trends and to conduct a demography study to know what the future would look like for enrollment in Bethel Park. The third concern would be about inequity in classrooms, particularly at the elementary buildings. The class sizes differed from as small as 15 up to as large as 24 or 25. And the question they asked was, how do we balance those class sizes across 5 buildings? The fourth is concern about educational quality. What were the trends in education that the district should be addressing through the facilities and any work that could be or should be done in the facilities? The board was concerned that no educational curriculum reviews had been conducted in 3 or 4 years and was concerned that the trends in education were moving forward and Bethel Park wasn't following. And the fifth issue that they gave to the Hayes Group was about financing. And the question was, how do we invest our tax dollars to achieve the best possible outcomes while maintaining good stewardship of the taxpayers' investment? Knowing that some work has to be done, what's the best use of those dollars to address the work? So the Hayes Group then brought a team of engineers and architects and educational consultants on site through the winter and spring of 2021 to analyze all the data, visit the buildings, look closely at the infrastructure, the mechanical systems, other major portions and aspects of the buildings. And they also spend time with the people in the buildings, educators, administrators, and other support staff, to learn as much as they could in pursuit of these questions. There were 6 general conclusions that they were able to draw from their time in this study. These general takeaways, we'll call them, helped to direct the options that the board would then have to consider moving forward. Takeaway number 1 is that the Bethel Park school district's enrollment would probably stay stable over the next 10 years. The enrollment was currently at 3880, and it had declined over 10 years' time from about 800 more students 10 years ago. But the demographer, this gentleman from CMU who conducted the demographic study, drew a general conclusion that our enrollment would stay stable at about 3,700, maybe up to 4,200 over the next 10 years, or maybe down a couple hundred students. But generally, we could expect with a reasonable confidence that our enrollment in Bethel Park would stay about 3,800 students. This meant that we would have a lot of capacity in our classrooms and in our buildings, that buildings that were built for much larger student population would then have room, potentially extra room, we'll call it extra real estate. The second takeaway from the feasibility study was that, thank you, that these buildings are aging. Other than the newer high school, the other buildings will need major investments, particularly in the major building systems, mechanical systems, over the next 5 to 10 years. They also found that the buildings were generally inaccessible for handicapped children, that there were opportunities to improve the building's security, that the mechanical systems were nearing their expected life and would need to be replaced over those years, and their cost estimates, based on the analysis of the architects and the engineers, would be, for those 7 buildings, the 5 elementary and the 2 middle schools, would be between $70 and $100 million worth of work to bring them up to 21st century spaces with new systems, upgraded furnishings and finishings. So the question then for the outcomes of the feasibility study is, how do we best invest these monies? The third takeaway is a recognition that there is not equity in class size or in students' educational experience in kindergarten through 4th grade. Discrepancies in class sizes, level and types of special education services available, and other support services, and even differences in the physical facilities available in the buildings. Buildings that have gyms separate from the cafeteria and buildings that don't would be a good example of those differences. And so the question that drives the outcomes of the feasibility study is, what investment do we then make to level the playing field? How do we bring that equity to each student's educational experience? The fourth takeaway speaks to the curriculum and the instructional issues. And as the board sent Hayes into the analysis to investigate what opportunities exist that we're missing, their findings sort of center around two issues. The first is a more 21st century orientation to our schools and our instruction and curriculum. By 21st century, we're talking about a more hands-on program, lab-based activity, for instance, more collaboration or integration, where perhaps 2 classes, an art and a social studies class, combine, and similarly an integrated curriculum where we learn multiple topics around particular themes, for instance. These are the 21st century thoughts that we should be looking at if we're going to be making any investment in our buildings. And the second is, along those same lines, is the opportunity to incorporate more STEAM spaces, maker spaces in each of the buildings with standard sets of resources, materials, infrastructure to give that STEAM experience for every student in their journey through elementary and middle school. So the question then became, what changes to the facilities would need to occur for us to implement these opportunities or take these opportunities? The fifth takeaway is a recognition that there is some unused space at Independence Middle School. It was originally designed as a middle school, 6th through 8th grade, and over the years, through various enrollment trends and changes, the board moved the 6th grade to Neil Armstrong Middle School, and so there is space that is designed for the middle school in 6th grade is not being used for that purpose. So the question then points the board to options on how we maximize that middle school concept for 6th graders. And then the 6th takeaway, the 6th summary point from the analysis that the Hayes Group conducted, is a recognition that there needs to be an investment on behalf of the district to upgrade the facilities, to replace or upgrade and repair into mechanical systems, more equity or level loading of class sizes through the educational experience, implementing instructional curricular improvements through those design work, and do all of this in a financially sustainable way that also takes us beyond those immediate emergent needs. So the question then is, what are our options to address all of these issues? I'd like to take a few minutes and take a closer look at some of the findings from the Hayes study about each of the buildings. We'll start with the general. These items now on the screen are all of the items that Hayes Group found with their architects and engineers that would be common to all 7 buildings. That there were ADA compliance issues, code issues that would need to be addressed, elevators instead of ramps, for instance. That safety and security updates would be necessary and possible with the investment in the space. Replacing the windows throughout buildings would be necessary. Also replacing or updating the finishes in the buildings. Fire alarms and emergency exits could be upgraded. And sprinkler systems could be added to these buildings. It's worth noting that those last 2 items exist in buildings, but are designed from a much earlier time, and there's more sophisticated and efficient systems that would be considered. So that list is all the items that the buildings share. Here's the analysis of each of the individual buildings that were included in the study. We'll start with Abraham Lincoln. And the Hayes Group and the engineers tried to put it into terms that us educators could understand. And so they gave each building a general grade about its quality and the concerns that they find in their analysis. Lincoln was graded as a D, and they found approximately $10 million worth of work that would need to be done to address the issues at Lincoln. Not just the general school list that we saw on the previous slide, but replacing almost all of the HVAC equipment, that would be the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning equipment in the buildings, as well as the controls that operate those systems. And Lincoln also has some significant paving issues. The last major work done on Lincoln was 28 years ago. Franklin had work done more recently, but it was still 15 years ago. And Franklin was graded as a C in terms of quality. Estimates are $10.5 million worth of work at Franklin that would include the HVAC system and paving issues like the Lincoln list did. One of the things that's noted in Lincoln, Franklin, and most of the buildings is the absence of elevators, which would drive a significant expense to address in each of the buildings. Memorial is the next one that we looked at and received a report on. Memorial was graded as a C. It's been 13 years since the last major renovation work at Memorial. And their list is very similar to the other 2 elementary buildings, with the addition of replacing the original electric panel boards in the buildings. Those panel boards are original to the building from 1949. Washington is the one building that's had the most recent work done on the building. Back in 2015, they had some major work done on it, and its overall grade was a C, with about $7.5 million worth of renovation work to be done there, including water piping throughout the building would need to be replaced based on its condition, and a recommendation to paint the metal roof on Washington in order to extend its life. The last of the elementaries is William Penn, and it's been 28 years since any major work was done at William Penn Elementary. Its quality grade is a D, and there is an estimate of about $7 million worth of work to bring that building up to a high-quality grade. That would include a lot of masonry work, the HVAC systems in there, the domestic water service, including the pipes and valves, and some drainage and paving issues to be addressed at William Penn. It is worth noting that some good paving work happened this summer. The board did address that issue, and so that one could be taken off the list if the Penn work was approved to be completed. The next building that was studied was Neil Armstrong. 8 years ago, some work was done at Neil, but generally the most recent major work at the building was 30 years ago in 1991. At Neil's, one of the list items on the Neil list includes removing the partitions or movable walls and putting up more permanent separation of classrooms, LED lighting in place of the current lighting systems in the building. Like Penn, the domestic water service and piping and water heaters also need to be replaced, and they too have drainage and paving issues to address on the Neil site. And then the last of the 7 buildings to be looked at was Independence Middle School. Independence, built in '74. The last major work was about 8 years ago, but the major systems in the building are reaching about 30 years of life. So it's the HVAC system, egress issues, circulation or movement issues of how students move through the building, movable walls to be replaced. I mentioned HVAC, and again, like some of the other buildings, it's the domestic water system that would need to be replaced. Independence was evaluated at a C, with renovation costs of approximately $35.5 million worth of work for that building, obviously because it's one of the larger buildings in our system. They recommended it to be done in 2 phases, and we'll sort of see in the future options as to why there would be 2 phases to the IMS work. So you have a clear idea of the concerns, of the issues that the Hayes Group is presenting to the board, an understanding of the conditions and the work that needs to be done. And they also spent time talking to people that are in the buildings every day to understand what other opportunities exist, and if investments are to be made, how we can make the most wise investment, good stewardship of these facilities for the long term. So on the list here now in front of you on the screen are some of the things that were recurring messages from the staff, the administration and teachers that were interviewed during the evaluation process. Quick summary here. Number one thing above all else, teachers and administrators, everybody feels that whatever work we do, we must maintain and take advantage of the opportunity to advance the educational excellence in our learning environments. Number 2 on their generally concluded list would be that the facilities are adequate, if not excellent facilities, in order to deliver that 21st century education, that those folks that work in those buildings each day recognize the limitations that the spaces constrain them in order to achieve that 21st century approach to learning I described a short time ago. The third thing on the list was addressing the equity issues. Those inside the system recognize the disparity in class sizes and services available and the constraints, for instance, in buildings that don't have a dedicated gym space. We also heard from these folks about equity within the special education program. And in this sense, we're talking about allocating those resources as they're needed, even necessarily in unequal ways. But to do that, we then overcome any disparities in how we deliver education and services to children. And the last piece that we heard in these meetings from the staff and the administration and the faculty is to be sure we attend to school and campus safety with any redesign or any work that's to be done in the district. This is probably harder to read on the screen, but this is just an excerpt of what is a much more very in-depth demographic study about Bethel Park. I already referenced to the gentleman professor from CMU that did the demographic study, and the Hayes group was able to, from that, recognize or identify the fact that along the bottom row here, the building's current capacity and what the building was designed for in terms of capacity. Generally, you'll see across the board that the buildings have more space available than we have kids in those spaces. So the study then moved from fact-finding, system analysis, evaluation, more towards a synthesis of all the information and trying to gather all of those issues and opportunities to then drive towards a list of options that the board should consider in order to address the issues and take advantage of the opportunities. They actually presented 11 options, and in many of those 11, there were some sub-options, totaling more than 11 total choices that the board would have. The options generally address the issues in various ways, but they differ in terms of their cost and the amount of solutions that they provide to the board. The one critical factor, the one that we keep saying over and over again to make sure we're clear on this, is the board can't do nothing. They have to move on these systems. They have to address the issues so that the buildings aren't falling apart around the staff and the students, or that we're catch ourselves by surprise when a boiler won't light on a cold day in the winter. So there is work to be done. The board then, really the question becomes, which option is the most viable, the most affordable, and the most opportunistic? I'm going to turn the presentation over to my partner here, Dr. Gensani, who's going to talk about these options and go through each of them.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. So, as you see on the screen, what are the objectives we seek? What are we looking to achieve? Obviously, it's important for us to update or replace any of our aging facilities. And while doing that, we need to right-size our district's schools. And we've talked about equity in class sizes across all the elementary classrooms. That's very important. We've gotten a lot of feedback about that. And all along the way, we want to improve our educational quality through our facilities and infrastructure improvements in conjunction with instructional and curricular improvements. And the last part, we have to do this all and be fiscally responsible as we move about in consideration of the funding sources. Our list of master plan options for consideration. The Hayes Design Group initially looked at 20-plus options on what to do with our facilities. In other words, if we do this, what's the other options that can go along with that and coincide in a meaningful way? Of these, we are going to focus on 11 main categories, they have subcategories as well for consideration. The first consideration was to keep the 5 neighborhood schools, and that's option 1, keep that open. And obviously, in order to do that, we would have to provide equity and updates to all our 5 elementary buildings. Option 1B would be keep all the elementary schools open, but we would relocate the 4th graders to Armstrong, and make that a 4-5 intermediate school. And then at the same time, move 6th grade up to IMS and make that a 7 through 8 building. 6 through 8 building. And once again, we got to make sure that there's parity as we move forward. So option 3, now we're going to close a couple elementary buildings and see how that makes a difference. So close 2 elementary school buildings, and we're going to renovate the 3 remaining schools. And with those 3, we want to bring those up to speed so there's equity in the learning environments. Those would then become a K-4 elementary grade, K-4 elementary. Grade population is reassigned to remain 3 elementary schools as mentioned. And if we have to, additions would be considered in order to make it all even facilities. Option 3B, once again, we're going to close those at 2 elementary schools and make it a K-3 population, expand NAMS to become a 4, 5, and 6 building. IMS would, once again, as it is now, remain a 7, 8 building. Option 3C would be close 2 elementary school buildings as well. NAMS becomes a 4, 5. 6th grade moves to IMS without the need for any major additions. The remaining schools would be K-3. Population gets reassigned to those 3 elementary schools. Option 4, now we're going to close all elementary school buildings and construct a centralized K-4 elementary center. In doing so, we would keep NAMS open as a 5-6 intermediate school. And some various options off of option 4 would be, 4A would be construct a new elementary center on the existing fields at Neil Armstrong. Option 4B would be construct the new elementary center at the high school IMS site. There's about 80 acres up there, but as you know, most of it's spoken for. Option 4C, construct a new elementary center on the existing property at Benjamin Franklin Elementary School. And option 4D, convert the existing Ben Franklin building to a new elementary center with additions and alterations. Moving on to option 5, once again, close all existing elementary schools, expand and renovate NAMS into a K-5 elementary center, and once again, we would move 6th grade to IMS. Option 6 also includes closing all 5 elementary schools, add additions to house 5th grade population to the existing elementary schools, and renovate them. I'm sorry, we're going to keep those 5 open. We're going to keep them open. I said close them. That's a mistake on my part. Convert IMS to a 6, 7, 8 building, and we would close Neil Armstrong. Option 7, close 3 elementary schools, renovate 1 elementary building to a K-1 primary center, renovate 1 elementary building to a 2-3 elementary center. NAMS would become a 4-5, and IMS would house grades 6, 7, and 8. Option 8, close all existing elementary schools, build a new K-2 primary center, expand and renovate Neil Armstrong into a 3, 4, and 5 elementary center, move 6th grade up to Independence Middle School. Option 8A, we're going to construct a new primary center on the existing fields at Neil Armstrong. Option 8B, construct a new primary center on the high school IMS site. Option 8C, construct the new primary center, elementary center at Franklin Elementary School. And then option D would be to construct that center by renovating Franklin and with additions and alterations. Option 9 would be close all existing elementary schools, build a new K-3 elementary center at NAMS. NAMS would become a 4-5 school, and we're going to once again move 6th grade to IMS. Option 5A has to do really with the location and constructing that elementary center at the existing fields of NAMS. And once again, that's a K-3 elementary center. Option 9B would be to construct the location at the high school. Option 9C has to do with, once again, using that ancillary property at Ben Franklin, and constructing your elementary center there. And then option 9D would convert the current Ben Franklin building into a new primary center with additions and alterations. Option 10, we're getting closer. We got 2 more options. Option 10, close all existing elementary schools, build a new K-3 elementary center, expand Neil Armstrong to become the 4 through 6 building. IMS remains as is, a 7-8 building. And sub-option off of that, 10A, would be construct the elementary center on the existing fields at Neil Armstrong. 10B would be construct the new primary center at the high school. 10C would be construct the new primary center at Ben Franklin Elementary. 10D would be convert the existing buildings into new primary elementary center and alterations. Option 11, and of course, I neglected to say that really with all closures and building an elementary center, there would be consideration, as it's written here, with the possibility of a full-day kindergarten as an option. So with option 11, we would construct a new K-3 primary center, expand Neil Armstrong to include 4th grade, expand the high school, add on to the high school, to the right side of it, when you look at the high school by the auditorium, add on to accept the 7th and 8th grade, and in turn we would close Independence School. So I think it's back to you, Dr. Walsh.
Thanks. So in order for this study to be useful to the board, because 11 options with quite a few sub-options, the Hayes Group then went to work on trying to refine that list of options as to ones that would be practical and have the best chance of addressing all of the issues that the board is interested in, and taking advantage of all the opportunities that the board should be interested in. So on the screen here is a series of questions that the Hayes Group used to help them narrow down the options. So we'll call it the criteria to use. And it started first with looking at the spaces and the programming that would exist in those spaces. Another set of questions addressed to the building systems and the location of the site, of the school, as to how those systems could be maximized, and even looking at the site itself as to which location would be best for construction, for traffic, for parking, etc. So that's 12 more questions here, and then an additional 14 additional questions that they used to look at the financial considerations, depending on the options, and particular building systems, then what the cost would be to upgrade a building versus closing the building and constructing new. So quite a few questions that the Hayes Group used with their consultants, the engineers that were involved, the architects and so forth. What they ended up with the conclusion, I guess, of their demographics and feasibility study was a more refined list of not 11 total options, but 4 options. And we'll slide the microphone back to Dr. Gensani, and he'll go over the 4 remaining options as recommended by the Hayes Group.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. Hayes Design Group recommended the top 4 options as Dr. Walsh indicated as the next step. I'm going to go over each option along with what the advantages and disadvantages are, the core advantages and disadvantages. I'm going to begin with option 1, and that was to keep all 5 elementary schools open, move 4th to NAMS and 6th grade to IMS, and renovate the existing elementary schools. This is illustrated with option 1B. The advantages in that move with 1B is that students and families would maintain their current arrangement, which will maximize any disruption that could occur by a move. The renovation costs associated with providing equity and learning the program spaces at the elementary school would be lessened, as additional spaces in each elementary school would be created by removing the fourth grade population out of the current K to 4 elementary buildings. Disadvantages would involve the main reason that we still have a large issue with the balance of class sizes and the challenges that the number of students change at home addresses each year. In other words, our population fluctuates each year based on the number of students per street. So you would have to continually reallocate, redistrict to try to keep a balance, and that would cause continued disruption. Another main disadvantage is the rising cost of operating 5 buildings. That would not go away with option 1B. Let me just quickly go over the financial impact, the summary. So the total construction cost would be about $43.5 million. Annual financial cost, or finance costing, I should say, would be about $2.8 million. Conceptual cost savings, there would be no cost savings annually. Net cost of operating the budget, it would actually increase the costs by keeping those 5 elementary schools open, $2.8 million annually. Moving on to option 3C, this option takes a look at keeping some of the elementary buildings open and closing others. 3C closes 2 buildings and keeps 3 open, making those 3 a K to 3 situation. 4th grade would go to NAMS and 6 would go to IMS. The advantages of that move, the renovation costs associated with renovating remaining schools would be lessened due to the smaller number of buildings, fewer buildings. Staffing costs for the district would be reduced when we consolidate and close 2 schools. Some of the disadvantages would involve the renovation and building addition costs associated with updating the 3 elementary schools, trying to keep that equal, and also in doing so addressing the 21st century learning recommendations, current codes, and issuing the building systems that'll be substantial to get that all up to par. Another disadvantage would be level loading of the classroom sizes at K3 will be more easily accommodated than option 1B. However, it will continue to be a challenge throughout periodic redistricting, causing periodic redistricting. The summary of financial impact: total construction cost would be $31.5 million. Annual financial cost would be $2 million. Conceptual cost savings would be $2.15 to $2.3 annually. Net cost in operating the budget, there would be a savings of $150,000 to $300,000 annually. Looking at option 8, you can see the progression, keeping all open, then closing a few, and now we're taking a look at closing all the elementary buildings with option 8. Option 8 takes a look at, once again, closing them and creating an elementary center. This option looked at making room at NAMS by renovating and expanding it to a 3 to 5 building, along with building a new K to 2 center. Advantages and disadvantages. Let's start with the advantages. The renovation costs associated of the 5 elementary buildings would be eliminated. Staffing costs for the district would be reduced due to consolidation of 1 primary center. The new K2 primary center would better establish equity among students and level class sizes. And also, as I mentioned earlier, anytime we take a look at adding this elementary center, it would open up doors for the potential of full-time kindergarten in the new facility. Disadvantage: a substantial building action would be required at NAMS in order to support the 3rd grade population. The 5 elementary school buildings currently provide recreational space for after hours through the use of, the green spaces, the play fields, the gyms, the multi-purpose rooms. That could possibly be eliminated and closed and sold with the closure of the 5 buildings. A new district-wide K-2 elementary center would have a large initial cost. Let's look at the financial impact. The total construction cost would be $47 million, and that cost includes a building addition to add 3rd grade at NAMS. Also add an additional $1 million in cost for option 8C, which is closing the Franklin site.
It was choosing Franklin, not closing.
In choosing the Franklin, I said closing, in choosing the Ben Franklin site. Annual financial costs would be $3.1 million. Conceptual cost savings, $3.25 to $3.5 annually. Net cost into operating budget would be a savings of $150,000 to $400,000 annually. And option 9, which is close all existing elementary buildings, all 5 elementary schools. We'd build a new K-3 elementary center. NAMS would become grades 4 and 5. 6th grade would make its way up to IMS. And the 2 sub-options, 9A, would be construct that elementary center on the existing fields at Neil Armstrong. Option 9C would be construct a new primary center, elementary center, at the existing property at Ben Franklin Elementary School. Advantages, the renovation costs associated with updating the 5 elementary schools would be eliminated. That would be gone. Staffing costs, we'd be able to reduce the amount of staff with the consolidation as folks retired, we wouldn't have to replace. New K-3 elementary center would be better established, that equity that we're looking for with class size and really facility-wise as well. Future full-time kindergarten, once again, would be designed into the plans of the building. No other building additions would be required at NAMS or IMS to support the new grade configurations. There are, however, some disadvantages. The 5 elementary school buildings that currently provide that recreational space we spoke about a minute ago, after-hours activities, could possibly be eliminated. You know, the green space, the gyms, the multi-purpose rooms that those 5 elementaries provide for the recreation groups would be gone. New district-wide K-3 elementary center would have a large initial cost. Looking at that financial impact, the total construction cost of this option would be $43 million. The annual financial cost would be $2.75 million. The conceptual cost savings, $3.25 to $3.5 million annually. And the net cost of the operating budget, this one has the largest savings amount annually, from $500,000, $500,000 to $750,000 annually. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Gensani, for reviewing those 4 remaining options from the Hayes Group. Here, the graphic that you see here on the screen presents a review of those conclusions that the board gave to Hayes to start the study, that the Hayes Group found throughout the course of the study, and how close do these options come to solving or addressing each of those major issues. So for instance, in terms of options 1B, 3C, 8A or C, or option 9A or C, only the K-3 primary center does the most complete job at right-sizing the capacity. For instance, the K-2 primary center doesn't do a complete job because it requires adding real estate onto the NAMS building in addition to building a K-2 center. So the smarter investment then would be to use NAMS at the capacity that it exists, put IMS at its capacity, and build a building for the K-3 population. Similarly, at the bottom row, you'll see the cost effectiveness is analyzed there. The most cost-effective approach would be the K-3 center because of the efficiencies in the operational budget. For instance, not having to do an addition at NAMS, being able to maximize your teaching force, needing fewer nurses and principals and support staff in the buildings if you were concentrated on one K-3 primary center. I'll note that in option 3C, that keeping the 3 elementary buildings doesn't earn it a perfect score. There is still the fact that those 3 buildings and the other 2 middle school buildings are existing in those older foundational buildings, whereas the K-3 primary center eliminates those 5 elementary buildings and puts everybody in the new space there. This slide takes the same approach. It divides the options up and looks at the financial costs, sort of the big financial picture that the board has to consider with all of this. I think it's important to note, again, as we said earlier in this presentation, that the board can't do nothing, that the work needs to be done. The question really that's driving this is to how to best make these investments. What's the best way to invest the dollars? So the second row there outlines the total capital and financing costs of each of the options, and that row specifically focuses just on the elementary buildings renovated or constructed. The next row below that describes the operational savings that could be occurred because of the reduction of buildings or the non-reduction of buildings, less transportation or the same transportation, less electric and energy costs or the same energy costs, all the way from a $2.8 million cost because of debt service all the way up to a $500,000 to $750,000 savings based on the options that they were to choose. Below that is, of course, a review of those middle school costs. I want to draw attention to the 8A or 8C column because the primary center K2, while it would have about a $37 or $38 million price tag, there would be a $10 million cost to add an addition onto NAMS to fit the 3rd grade. The K3 center has a $45 million cost, but there is no investment in NAMS, additional real estate put into NAMS with that option. So really the net impact, that last row on the bottom, the net impact on the budget is somewhere between $3 and $3.6 million, depending on the option that the board would pick. I think it's also important to note at this point that the board currently invests about $6 million in debt service annually for the cost of the high school project. That debt will be retired in a few years, and the financial perspective we're taking on this is to weave these costs into what they refer to as a wrap, or refinancing, perhaps, of those costs so that there could be a negligible impact on the local budget, maintaining about a $6 million debt service payment over the life of that debt for 20 years. The next steps, I guess, or what everybody's question would be, what comes next? How and when do we decide? What's the timeline look like? The first thing that needs to happen would be for the board to commit to one of those feasibility options that were presented. Dr. Gensani reviewed all 4 of the remaining final options, and it's possible, too, that the board has, that could consider a combination of or a 5th option that wasn't presented. Once that occurs, then there'd be about another 2-month time period during which the board would need to commit to an architect or architectural firms to advance the work that was necessary by their selected options. Architects would need an additional 8 to 10 months' time to do the designs, to have those stakeholder meetings, to share the plans and get feedback, ultimately to a point by which they would be ready to send out to bid by contractors. It takes about 2 months' time for that work to bids to be received, reviewed, and awarded by the board, and for then those contractors to get notice to proceed and for work to begin. If the selected option was renovation work, you would expect about 18 to 20 months worth of time for that work to occur. If it was new construction, you're talking about 20 to 24 months' time. So you add all that together, and you recognize, of course, that moving kids, relocating schools, opening and cutting ribbons on new buildings, all is about 30 to 36 months away from the point at which the board actually makes the commitment to the option. So again, it's worth repeating that whenever the board makes a decision, all of this would officially occur. Ribbons would be cut and kids would be moved about 30 to 36 months after that point. I think it's also important to point out that all 4 of the remaining options that the board has to consider include moving the 6th grade into IMS to put it back to its original design and to capitalize on the middle school concept. And so the board has already engaged an architectural firm to design the work that would need to be done for IMS. I said a short time ago in the presentation that the renovation costs of IMS were put into 2 phases. The first phase, about $10.5 million worth of work, would be the work that was necessary to make space to fix the space and ready the space for the 6th grade students. The second phase worth of work would be all the remaining work in the 7th and 8th grade wings, the arts and music wings, the cafeteria, the mechanical systems, et cetera. Total cost $35 million, 10.5 of which could come first to make the space ready for 6th grade move. So that work is being planned. That work would happen regardless of any of the 5 options that the board has to consider. So that brings us then to the conclusion. You've heard from us all of the information that was given to the architects to set them on the work, and also what the architects found in their studies, and also how the work was done, leading us to those options that the board has now in front of them to address the concerns that they had at the beginning of this study. The aging facilities concerns, the educational opportunity concerns, the financial stewardship concerns. They now have to make that decision. Dr. Gensani and I recognize that this is being broadcast live, and we're going to open a phone line here shortly for folks that are watching to provide comment or feedback or advice. We'll be taking good notes to share with members of the board. I know in the room with us tonight is board member who's listening and will be able to take that advice under advisement as they make these decisions. And the rest of the board will also receive a complete list of feedback and comments. If you're watching this video from a recording, then of course that phone line will not be open and feedback can't be provided to us live. But instead you're invited to take those links from the website for school board members and send them emails with your thoughts about the feasibility study options that they have in front of them. So while we get the phone line set up, I'll take a minute and share that phone number with you. The phone number you would call to provide that feedback, if you're on the live feed, is 412-851-6911. And we'll pause now a little bit while Dr. Gensani gets those phone lines open and turns on the calling system so we can receive those calls. We'll also reset our cameras since the presentation part of this is over. Be able to see us again here in the room. And I'm just stalling here long enough to get the phone lines open and to take the calls.
Ready to connect. Click Connect to show now.
While we're waiting for the phone systems to be live, we do want to emphasize a couple of points for you. Number one is that this presentation, the entire PowerPoint that you saw, is already posted online on our school district website under Facilities Planning. You can see all of the documents from the Hayes Design Group, quite an extensive list of documents that are there, a big file, and including the demographer study with the findings from the demographer and all of the recommendations there. This presentation is hosted there, as well as a presentation we gave a month ago to the board about the sixth graders and the advantages of putting sixth grade in the middle school at IMS. All those documents are available for your review if you'd like to take a closer look at all of that. And second point of emphasis is that this is being recorded so it can be archived and viewed later for folks who missed it tonight and would like to get up to speed on the feasibility study and all of those options, so that those that are watching the archived version of this presentation would have to provide their feedback via email to board members whose addresses are on the district website board.
We have one call.
Okay.
So, press talk.
Hello, we have Mrs. Yee. It looks like you're our first caller. Yeah, you're on. Can you hear us?
Okay, so why is it? It's showing.
Yeah, so we're showing a caller here from Bethel Park, and its name was Yee, Y-E-E, is showing up on our screen. You are on live. If you can talk, yeah, we should be able to hear you. If not, we're doing something wrong on our end, and we humbly apologize if it's not getting through to you. Okay, one more time, Mrs. Yee, you're on with Dr. Gensanti and I. Yeah, I'm sorry to say we're not hearing the caller and the questions that the caller has. It's not coming through our system, so it was working earlier today. We're not sure what's happening on your end or on our end, but I apologize to the caller that we're not hearing what you have to share. We're going to recommend perhaps that you use an email instead, since we couldn't get you to connect.
Maybe if they call back in, maybe it'll work a second time.
Okay.
I dropped the call so they can try it again.
Yep, look like it's tried again. Can you see it? It's showing up there on the list. Let's try this again. Same caller. We're going to connect. Okay, you're live. Ms. Yee, can you hear us? Yeah, we're still not hearing anything from it. The phone is connected in our system. We should be able to hear this caller and the questions. What does the hold music thing say up there? Oh.
Not on mute.
Correct.
I'm going to try to call the caller back.
Well, you have to disconnect first there.
I'm going to drop that.
Hello, we have a call. Can you hear us?
How about we use a cell phone? I don't know what else to do. We could run it through my phone.
We're going to try and call this person because her number is showing up.
Hello.
Hi, this is Martha Yee.
Hi, I'm sorry. Well, I'm not sure what's happened to our system, but we can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, I was on hold and then it disconnected and I tried calling back anyway. First I went into, I don't know if you need my address, 5863 Wallace Avenue. First I just wanted to thank everybody for releasing all the information ahead of time so people could review it, and then having not one but two meetings just so that everybody had an opportunity to hear the information. I really appreciate that. My question, I guess, would be more about in regards to the timeline. So I know that there was a lot of talk about sixth grade, actually the current fifth graders moving next school year to IMS. And I was wondering if that was still going to happen, or if that was going to be delayed until some of the construction can happen. And
Yes.
my other concern was not so much with the fact that sixth grade would be moving. It's more just the time. So right now with the kids still in a pandemic and having to wear masks and all that, my current fifth grader, she left third grade, halfway through. Her fourth grade year was not great, and she's finally getting comfortable at Neil Armstrong. And my concern is for the students at that age then having to readjust again so quickly. I would hope that when this does happen, that parents and students would be given at least a school year notice, just because I know for my child it would be beneficial to say, you're starting at this school, well, this is going to be your only year here, that's okay, we're going to make the most of it, instead of her becoming comfortable and then learning, at Christmas time that you're moving next year too. So that was kind of my concern.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty important concern. First, thanks for your feedback on the information and the timeline. I can say that for sure, the timeline is such that nobody's moving until the work is finished. That's the commitment that we've tried to impress on the board, the architects, everybody involved in this, is that while the work at IMS may start next year, there is not a current plan or any intention to move the kids next year. And in fact, the current thinking would be to do all the movement when the projects are finished. That would be approximately 30 to 36 months after the board makes the decision. So this could be 3 years away before anybody's moving to any sixth grades moving to IMS.
I think that's a great decision, and while it might, affect, I do have yet another student, younger one who, might be moving, instead of, having fourth grade in elementary school, might be moving out, for their fourth grade year. But being able to know that ahead of time, I think is just so beneficial. So I really do appreciate everybody kind of taking that just, into thought, and just, yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the feedback.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
We had, hopefully you could hear that on the stream video feed, that question about the timeline. Again, I believe my answer was the same from this one to any other question about the timeline. It's more likely that any movement of kids into new facilities or renovated facilities would be approximately 30 to 36 months away. One of the things she intimated but didn't act directly, I'll clarify this, it is possible that could be work happening in a building in places where students are not. The work at IMS could be started during the school year down in the sixth grade wing, and students would be cordoned off from getting into those areas during the work. And as project moved into other areas, we would move kids away from those spaces into finished renovated spaces or other spaces, so that the contractors could have special access, only access, secure access to that work. But to answer the question again more succinctly, don't see anybody moving next year. And yes, there could be work happening in a building during the school day. So that was the last of the callers, and we're going to again invite those that are watching the stream after the live feed during a recorded version of this. You're invited to send your thoughts via email. Members of the board are listed on the school district website. You could send your notes, thoughts, opinions to the members of the board that would then be able to use that information in their deliberations to choose the 4 options. So on behalf of Dr. Gensani and the members of the board in attendance tonight, I want to thank folks for joining in and participating in the information session. More details on the website, more plans on the website. Feel free to dig deep into all that information so that you're caught up on where things stand with these feasibility options. Wish the best for our students and staff in their school year, and a pleasant day to all those in attendance.